A slight delay in starting today. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement at JTS, and I'm so pleased that you've joined us for today's session of our ongoing spring series, The Other in Jewish Text and Tradition. A special welcome to any first-time attendees, and you can view past recordings of past sessions using the link that was in the email that you received earlier today. We're pleased to have a completely different kind of session today, in addition to an instructor who hasn't taught in our Monday webinars before. So thank you so much to Dr. Alexander Weisberg, who is an adjunct instructor at JTS, for joining us today to teach on the non-human other. He'll be exploring the ethics of how we relate to animals in the Jerusalem Talmud. We are so grateful to our sponsors for today's session, Dale Atkins Rosen and Robert Rosen. Thank you so much to the Rosens. Everyone else, if you're feeling inspired by this learning with JTS's outstanding scholars, we invite you to consider sponsoring a session yourself. We have two sponsorship levels, Chacham for $540 and Sadiq for $1,000. And to learn more, you can contact learninglives@jtsa.edu. And our sponsors for today, Dale Atkins Rosen and Robert Rosen, are sponsoring at the Sadiq level. So thank you so very much again. I might now turn things over to Tani Schwartz-Herman to give us a bit more information about today's session.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. Just to go over how the Q&A will work for today. Dr. Weisberg will pause for questions periodically throughout the class, and we will also have some time for Q&A at the end. You can use the chat feature to submit your question to Rabbi Julia Andelman. During the Q&A period, Rabbi Andelman will select a few of the questions to present to Dr. Weisberg. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with either myself or Lynn Feynman. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received with the Zoom link for the session. We'll be screen sharing them as well. I'm now pleased to introduce Dr. Alexander Weisberg, and he's an adjunct instructor at JTS and was also recently a postdoctoral teaching fellow at NYU. He is a scholar of Jewish studies, environmental humanities, and religion. His research explores the non-human in ancient Jewish literature and culture. You can learn more about Dr. Weisberg as well as his research and published works in the full bio on the sources. I'm now pleased to turn it over to Dr. Weisberg.
All right, thank you so much. So happy to be here and to be sharing. Is everybody hearing me? All good? Okay, great. For some reason, I'm not on speaker view right now. It's still on you, Tani. At least that's what I'm seeing. Are you seeing me?
I see you, so I'm not sure why you don't see.
No, that's kind of strange. Okay, well, I guess I'll be looking at you during the session. No problem. Okay, great. So thanks so much for having me. We'll get into the talk, and when I'm ready to jump into the sources, I'll screen share those with everybody. Okay, great. So what does Judaism think of the non-human others that are the closest to us, animals? What type of orientation should we have towards them? And are there specific ethics that should frame the way we treat them? And what might this orientation tell us about what Judaism thinks about the human or Jewish individual? This question is all the more perplexing in relation to a tradition that places the sacrifice of animals as a central, if not the central mechanism or medium of communication between humanity and the divine. As Aaron Gross, scholar of Judaism, religion, and animal studies, has explained, different ethical orientations of the animal separate different visions of the kind of being Jewish traditions asks Jews to be. And these different visions are various configurations of the human subject, the very ethical being which many of us look towards Judaism to explicate. He goes on to explain that the humane subject can also be described as a tripartite structure within which animal, human, and divine serve as the main points of orientation. Indeed, if we speak about the human relationship to the animal, this always implies a third. Some deeper ground of truth that gives ultimate meaning to a distinction between human and animal and sets them in proper relation. In other words, God is always part of the picture when we speak about human and animal relationships. And that to fully grasp what Judaism tells us about humanity and its relationship to God, we need to also grasp what it tells us about human-animal relationships. Not only this, but thinking about animals is vital to the present moment in other ways as well. According to several studies, the animal agriculture industry is the single largest contributor of greenhouse gases globally. More land is dedicated to raising animals for food, including the food they eat, than any other human use of land. Farming animals on an industrial scale pollutes the localities in which they exist to such an extent that the land near such sites is rendered uninhabitable and useless for any other agricultural activity. Animals born for food within the industrial food complex are born into a life of immense suffering. This suffering is passed from generation to generation and what can only be called the flagrant torture of life. And then this suffering is eaten by the consumer because it is cheap and plentiful. The industrial agricultural complex does all it can to obfuscate its workings and shroud in darkness what it does behind closed doors in order to conceal the mass suffering of animals and widespread abuse of human labor. These efforts include lobbying to enact gag orders that prevent the flow of information of what happens inside of what are called CAFOs, confined animal feeding operations, and slaughterhouses, and to prevent the dissemination of information that industrial animal agriculture is warming the planet and destroying the ecosystems in which it operates. We moderns face a situation. If we partake in industrial food, our daily food consumption is weaved in a web of human and animal torture and suffering, such as never been seen before. But does all of this have to be? Does our difference from animals necessitate this result as some sort of logical conclusion of who we are and whom animals are? If we continue to ignore the ways that these beings are involved in our collectives and demand consideration of us, we will remain blind to the effects that we have upon the world and that all the denizens of the world have upon us. In this scenario, we will end up with the worst possible scenario, in which the human species and many other species no longer exist. For we are in the midst of the sixth great extinction. We will see that rabbinic texts offer a different relationship between humans and animals than the modern Western one. According to our texts, it does not have to be an all or nothing proposition in which humanity must stop eating animals or engaging with them as technology. Our rabbinic traditions suggest that animals can be part of commercial, ritual, political, and agricultural entanglements, and they can be eaten, but their lives must be valued, they must be cared for, and their suffering must be minimized. In turning to a sequence of narratives in the Jerusalem Talmud, in Tractate Demai, with an attention to animals at the forefront, we will find that the Yerushalmi suggests an ethics for becoming with other animal species that, if developed, could be deployed within Jewish communities and beyond as a model for how to live in an entangled and interconnected multi-species and multi-natural world. Donna Haraway, philosopher and writer, has written extensively on the ways that we become with other beings on this planet, and especially animals. She calls actors that become with one another companion species. Her notion of companion species is critical for the work of coming down to earth and will act as a theoretical frame for our exploration of the Jerusalem Talmud and its animal ethics. She explains that beings, quote, through their reaching into each other, through their graspings, constitute each other in themselves. Beings do not pre-exist their relatings. The world is a knot in motion. There are no pre-constituted subjects and objects, and no single sources, unitary actors, or final ends. There cannot be just one companion species. There have to be at least two to make one. It is in the syntax. It is in the flesh. It is about the inescapable, contradictory story of relationships, co-constitutive relationships, in which none of the partners pre-exist the relating, and the relating is never done once and for all. According to Haraway, different beings create one another in their relatings and in their companionship. Because of this, companion species implode the very notions of nature and culture in the relentlessly historically specific joint lives of animals and people who are bonded in significant otherness, end quote. Because of this, the truly radical ethical movement vis-a-vis modernity resides right now in the everyday relationships that emerge from species becoming with one another. We do not need to think with the grand, the universal, or the global in order to find the current path of revolution and change. Indeed, we will see from our foray into a series of tales from the Talmud Yerushalmi that even the smallest mouse and the least imposing donkey are constituent parts of such emergent becomings. When we heed the call of noticing non-humans, we will find in the Yerushalmi a robust ethics of becoming with non-humans, which is also an ethics of companion species. Before we turn to the Yerushalmi, I want to explore one of the areas of becoming that Haraway details in her explanation of the ways in which animals serve as technology and workers for humans and the symbiotic development this engenders. This area of concern will be helpful for understanding our main protagonist's relationship to animals and other non-humans in the stories to be analyzed in the Yerushalmi. Rebbe Pinchas ben Yair also becomes with animals and other non-humans in his usage of them as tools or to solve problems for his constituents. Haraway explains that humans and animals have developed together through the example of working farm dogs. Quote, working dogs are tools that are part of a farm's capital stock, and they are laborers who produce surplus value by giving more than they get in a market-driven economic system. Dogs' roles have been multifaceted, and they have not been passive raw material to the action of others. Further, dogs have not been unchangeable animals confined to the supposedly ahistorical order of nature, nor have people emerged unaltered from the interactions. Relations are constitutive. Dogs and people are emergent as historical beings, as subjects and objects to each other, precisely through the verbs of their relating. People and dogs emerge as mutually adapted partners in the nature cultures of lively capital. It is time to think harder about encounter value. Haraway views animal workers as technologies developed and deployed in complex collectives of humans and animals, rather than simply as exploited and dominated creatures. For Haraway, nature and culture are not two distinct categories that can be separated out because they are formed one with the other. This is why she uses the term nature culture to signify always already hybrids and mixtures. For Haraway, we have never really separated nature from culture, despite how much us moderns have tried and have protested to the contrary. Rather, humans have always been part of the world they live in, and their subjectivities and ways of being have been shaped through their interactions with non-humans, which are also shaped by humans. For our part, in our exploration of the Yerushalmi, we will use the term divine nature culture, because God and heaven are always present for the rabbis of late antiquity. For Haraway, because of this interdependence and co-constitution, value is created in the very encounter between humans and their animals. Animals and their humans are changed by such relationships, in which they become together to form broader and more versatile collectives. Haraway writes further, quote, that instrumental relations of people and animals are not themselves the root of turning animals or people into dead things, into machines whose reactions are of interest but have no presence, no face, that demand recognition, caring, and shared pain. Instrumental interaction itself is not the enemy. Indeed, work, use, and instrumentality are intrinsic to bodily webbed, mortal, earthly being and becoming, end quote. She explains that the utilization of animals as technologies is not what deadens human and animal relationships in itself. To the contrary, it is the very process of animals being utilized as biotechnologies that they are included in collectives and form nature cultures with their human owners. It is when animals are only viewed as machines rather than subjects, and the becomings they are engendered, that are engendered between humans and their animals are ignored and denigrated, that animal work becomes exploitative. We will see in our narrative, in Yerushalmi Damai, that the Yerushalmi's ideal ethical stance towards being and becoming with non-humans does not hang on whether one utilizes animals or other beings as workers or for the sake of human needs, but rather whether one treats them as subjects and notices and cares for their suffering. When one does notice animals and other non-humans, they even begin to speak. This ethical difference is depicted through an encounter between Rebbe Yehuda Hanassi and Rebbe Pinchas ben Yair. In Yerushalmi Damai, their encounter is preceded by a litany of tales of becoming that feature Rebbe Pinchas working with and talking to non-humans. I know all of this was a bit complex, so I'll pause here for some questions before turning to the story, if there are any.
Well, there's a somewhat specific question. I don't know if you want to address this now or not. There's a question about how the differences between the developed world and, or the first world and the third world, whatever terminology you want to use, that kind of improving our practices here in the first world might raise the price of food in the third world, so that they're competing ethical imperatives there in terms of, affordable protein versus big agra, or however you want to position those opposites. Is that, this is not something that I know about, so I don't know if that's a question that makes sense to you.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that's a very complex question. I'm certainly not an expert in global agricultural markets and animal food markets, but from my understanding, I don't think that improving animal welfare here would have much of an impact on emerging food markets. It may, I'm not going to speak about it because I'm not an expert. So I'm going to stick to the text that we're dealing with, and I'll let an agricultural expert deal with that question. It's a little bit safer.
Okay, and just one more that just came in. I'll just read this. The person wrote, you mentioned that it's not exploitative if one acknowledges and addresses the possibility of animals suffering. How about their joy or pleasure or comfort? Does that matter also?
Of course, that totally matters. I think I'm focusing on their suffering right here, because that's often what is discussed when speaking about the exploitation of animals or of other workers. I think that Haraway is working within a Marxist framework of labor as exploitation, and she's trying to open this up, or open up the question of, well, what happens in labor relationships when different people or different animals meet, and the relationships that can be engendered and the value that can be created through the encounter itself. So of course, joy, happiness, freedom all matter in those relationships. She mainly is bringing up the question of, if there's suffering or within a labor relationship, does that necessitate that it's exploitative, or can both parties gain within that relationship? Does that make sense?
It does. I'm starting to think about the Amazon unionization, all of that, but let's not go there. I think other than that, people are really eager to get into the sources. All
right, awesome. So I'm going to share the same short source sheet that was sent out to you. Does everybody see the source sheet? All good? Okay, great. So let's get going. So Rebbe Pinchas ben Yair, a beloved holy man, lives with non-humans as companion species and understands the creation as an integrated and hybrid divine nature culture. The first tale in our narrative sequence on Yerushalmi Damai 1:3, 21b to 22a, is about his companion donkey. So I'm going to jump into the text here and read it in English. The donkey of Rebbe Pinchas ben Yair was stolen by thieves at night. It remained in hiding with them for 3 days and would not eat a thing. After 3 days, they changed their minds and returned her to her master. They said, let's send her to her master so she won't die with us and ruin our cave. They sent her out, and she went and stood outside her master's gate and started to bray. He said to them, open the gate for that poor creature that hasn't eaten a thing in 3 days. So the story begins in a normal enough, if not tragic fashion. Rebbe Pinchas's donkey was stolen from him by bandits. However, the story quickly takes a quirky and hopeful turn by informing us that Rebbe Pinchas's donkey refuses to eat for 3 days, forcing the bandits to set the donkey free, lest it die and stink up their cave. The donkey then proceeds to find her way home, another surprising and happy detail. Upon arrival, Rebbe Pinchas tells his students to let the donkey in because it hasn't eaten for 3 days, showing concern for his donkey, using the term alivata, which means poor thing and typically refers to a suffering subject. Another surprising detail. Not only has a donkey refused to eat, but her master somehow knows this to be the case without having even seen the donkey. How? Does Rebbe Pinchas understand the donkey's brays? Was she telling him that she hasn't eaten since she was stolen? The story continues. They opened the gate for her, and she came in. He said to them, give her something to eat. They placed before her barley, but she did not want to eat. They said to him, Master, she does not want to eat. He said to them, has the food been properly tithed? They said to him, yes. He said to them, have you taken damai, tithes taken in the account of doubt? They said to him, but has not the master taught us in a Mishnah? One who buys produce for planting to feed domesticated animals, he uses flour for hides, for lamp oil, or oil for anointing utensils is exempt from damai. Rabbi Pinchas said to them, what can we do with this poor one? She is so strict with herself. They took damai and she ate. In this section of the tale, Rabbi Pinchas tells his students to present food to his donkey, but she won't eat. He questions them on whether they have tithed the produce and also taken damai, tithes removed in the case of doubt. These are tithes taken from produce bought from common folk who may or may not have taken all the necessary tithes from the produce before selling it. Rabbi Pinchas's students answer that the produce is properly tithed and does not need to have damai taken. In support of not taking damai, they repeat back to Rabbi Pinchas in the Mishnaic tradition that he taught them. Rabbi Pinchas answers that yes, they are correct, and this is not halachically mandated, but nonetheless, the donkey is strict with herself, and damai should be taken for her sake. From this explanation, we can answer the question of how Rabbi Pinchas knew that his donkey had not eaten. He knows his donkey would not eat food that has not been properly tithed, and would not even eat food if damai was not taken from it when necessary, even though this is extra legal. Rebbe Pinchas knows what his donkey will and will not do because they share a bond of practice. They are companion species in a divine nature culture, in which human-mediated divine law is mixed with bodily hunger and instinct, and pathways of human and animal knowing. Indeed, the question of whether the donkey is an it or a she is clarified in this response, and an important lesson is taught to Rebbe Pinchas's students and the readers of this tale. Before Rebbe Pinchas explains that she is so strict on herself, we could have thought that perhaps the donkey was only mimicking Rebbe Pinchas's piety, and that she is nothing more than his well-trained property. Even though the donkey asserts herself as a subject and actor in her own right through refusing to eat non-tithed food, it might cross the minds of his students or the reader of the Sugya that this is just a learned behavior taught by Rebbe Pinchas. As Vincent Desprez, a scientist and animal studies scholar, has written, quote, animals are suspected much more rapidly than are humans of lacking autonomy. Manifestations of this suspicion proliferate, especially when it concerns actions, such as cultural behaviors that have for a long time been considered as proper to man. Consider, for instance, the recent observation of a striking display of mourning among a group of chimpanzees in a Cameroon sanctuary while confronting the death of a particularly loved peer. Because this behavior was sparked by the initiative of trainers to show the body of the deceased to her kin, criticism went into full swing. It was not real mourning. The chimpanzees should have manifested it spontaneously, somehow, all by themselves. As if our own grief in the face of death arose all by itself. As though becoming a painter or artist did not come from learning the gestures of those who preceded us, such as the continuation over and over again of themes that were created before us and that each artist hands down, end quote. Desprez explains that human denigration of the acts of animal learning and apprenticeship as slavish is part of the human tendency to shore up the human difference from animals. The Yerushalmi, however, in this instance, runs against the grain of this human tendency and seeks to depict Rebbe Pinchas's donkey's strictness as her own. Rebbe Pinchas calls her he in Hebrew, which means she, rather than zot, or it, and throws his hands up and says, what can we do about this creature that is so strict on herself? In these words, he presses upon his students and the reader that she, by her own agency, is strict on herself and going beyond halachic boundaries in her piety. In this proclamation, he asserts her subjectivity and agency, refuting those that would demean the donkey's actions as mere slavish apprenticeship. The donkey's piety, exclaims Rebbe Pinchas, is no less than that of you and me, and perhaps is even more. And through this, Rebbe Pinchas and the narrator of the story refuse to accept that the donkey's drama is simply about Rebbe Pinchas. Like Haraway writes about dogs, Rebbe Pinchas's donkey is, quote, not a projection, nor the realization of an intention, nor the telos of anything, end quote. Rebbe Pinchas and his donkey are companion species that become together. While Rabbi Pinchas's donkey assumedly did learn halacha from her master, this story begs the question, why would we want to denigrate the donkey's action as somehow less than human? The donkey goes beyond the legal tradition that Rabbi Pinchas himself taught to his students, and through this, perhaps teaches Rabbi Pinchas how to go beyond the strict line of the law. The following tales in Yerushalmi Damai depict Rabbi Pinchas's piety and a similar stance to the law as his donkey. We are left to wonder from this opening tale, whose piety came first, and whether the piety of one does not indeed build upon the piety of the other. In the following tales in the Yerushalmi's narrative sequence about Rebbe Pinchas, we learn that he solves problems through what Haraway calls emergent practices. Haraway explains that these are, quote, vulnerable on-the-ground work that cobbles together non-harmonious agencies and ways of living that are accountable both to their disparate inherited histories and to their barely possible but absolutely necessary joint futures, end quote. Rabbi Pinchas looks towards the distributed agency of the creation to care for his constituents. We can conjecture that Rabbi Pinchas developed this ability through his intimate relationship and care with his donkey, and his donkey that he knows so well. Much of his ability to commune with non-humans rests on his piety, and as we suggested, his very orientation to going beyond the strict line of the law may be a result of becoming with his companion donkey. One of the next stories in the Yerushalmi's narrative sequence further develops the divine nature culture that Rebbe Pinchas lives, which he extends throughout his orbit. Rebbe Pinchas ben Yair came to a certain place. They came and said to him, mice ate all of our grain. He set a divine edict upon the mice, and they came together and began to clamor. He said to them, do you know what they are saying? They said to him, no. He said to them, they are saying that the grain has not been tithed. They replied, the townspeople, pledge yourself to us that if we tithe the grain, the mice won't eat it all. He pledged to them, and they were no longer injured by the mice. This story highlights Rebbe Pinchas's unique ability to communicate with non-humans through language. The ability to communicate with animals in rabbinic literature is not an ability that the average person has and is generally associated with holy men. In this story, Rebbe Pinchas comes upon a town where mice are eating all of the town's grain. Rebbe Pinchas sets an edict upon the mice. This is perhaps a spiritual curse. The mice then come before him and tell him that the grain was not tithed, and because of this, they ate it. He then promises the townsfolk that if they tithe their grain, the mice will no longer eat it. This story highlights an additional aspect of the divine nature culture that Rebbe Pinchas lives, in the correspondence between halakha, or law, and the creation. He uncovers for others this divine nature culture and his ability to reach across species lines and create companionship, just like he does in the first story with his donkey. The disaster of the mice eating the grain, which could be chalked up to nature, is actually far from it. It is a combination of animal subjectivity and agency with divine law. The mice only ate the grain because the people of the town were not properly tithing their grains. These mice themselves are part of this divine nature culture in which the boundary between animal instinct and subjectivity and divine commandment is blurred. Rebbe Pinchas, however, is able to discern and delineate the place of all of these various agencies through his ability to commune with the creation and then to deploy various actors and agencies in emergent practices to solve problems for his constituents. These emergent practices collect together humans, animals, things, and the divine into solutions that work for the greater benefit. The next story in the Sugya depicts another way that Rebbe Pinchas uses his ability to communicate with animals and his awareness of the divine nature culture to come to practical solutions. Through this tale, the Yerushalmi is painting a picture of Rebbe Pinchas as a famous holy man, known throughout the land of Israel and even beyond. We are informed that Rebbe Pinchas's ability to commune with animals is not only unique, but also well-known. A Saracen king's pearl fell and a mouse swallowed it. He came to Rebbe Pinchas ben Yair. He said to him, am I a charmer? Rebbe Pinchas to the king. The king said back to Rebbe Pinchas, I came to you because of your good name. Rebbe Pinchas set a divine edict upon the mice and they came together. Rebbe Pinchas saw one of them walking like a hunchback. Rebbe Pinchas said to the king, "It is by that." Rebbe Pinchas set a divine edict upon it, and the mice spit out the pearl. In this story, a non-Jewish king's pearl was swallowed by a mouse. He comes to Rebbe Pinchas to ask for help. Rebbe Pinchas retorts to the king that he is not a charmer, explaining in the process that his ability to commune with animals is an intrinsic part of how one should be in the world, not a distortion of the normal functioning of the creation. The king assures him that it is because of his renown that he has come, not because he seeks magic per se. Rebbe Pinchas proceeds to bring the mice out in a similar fashion as the previous tale, and shows the king which mouse ate the pearl. Rebbe Pinchas then sets a decree upon the individual mouse, and he spits up the pearl. This is another example of Rebbe Pinchas's deployment of an emergent practice and how this was valued even beyond the Jews of the land of Israel. The next story in our narrative sequence shows that Rebbe Pinchas not only can speak to animals, but also to parts of the landscape. It further shows that the moral fabric of the creation is entangled with its materiality. Rebbe Pinchas ben Yair was going to the house of assembly. The river Genai was overflowing. He said to it, "Genai, Genai, why do you prevent me from the house of meeting?" It split before him and he crossed. His students said to him, Are we able to cross?" Rebbe Pinchas said back to them, "Whoever knows of himself that he has never done anything wrong to another Jew may pass and not be injured." In this story, Rebbe Pinchas convinces a river to part for him so that he can reach the house of assembly for prayer or study. In this tale, the river is a subject, just like the mice and the donkey, and must be convinced to act. Furthermore, as Rebbe Pinchas explains to his students, who ask if it will also part for them, that it will only alter its natural course for those that are aligned with the moral fabric of the creation, which is to never harm a fellow Jew. This mandate of the Torah to love your fellow as yourself is embedded within the subjectivity of the river Genai, and its willingness or unwillingness to part for a human being. This is another example of human-mediated divine law and morality entangled with nature and in an integrated divine nature culture. Through these stories, we are presented with a robust characterization of Rebbe Pinchas. He is committed to non-humans as companion species, to becoming with them, and to finding emergent practices to solve problems that collect together a diverse array of subjectivities and agencies, human, non-human, and divine. In Rebbe Pinchas's world, a divine nature culture, God's law and morality are mixed together with human, animal, and physical materiality, desire, and subjectivity. Animals and rivers can speak, and Rebbe Pinchas can interpret these words to help his fellows. His world is a web of life in which agency is far from restricted to human action and intention. I will pause again here for questions.
Okay, we do have questions. And I just wanted to say also, your writing is so packed with ideas and dense. I think people are asking if you can go more slowly or share it off the page maybe, but let me share some questions.
Sure.
Okay, so there was just sorting through these just before you paused. There are a few questions actually challenging the idea that that the stories are actually about animals. So let me read a few comments. So one person writes, how are we to be, going back to the first story, how are we to be sure this is about a donkey and the donkey isn't rather standing in for a simple, uneducated person, such that the story is emphasizing that we should respect the spiritual understanding and righteousness of all people. And then she continued, the mice story is also likely not about mice, but about the divine protection on produce granted by tithing. And well, why don't I stop there? There's a few comments along those lines.
Okay, great. So certainly one way to interpret stories is through allegory, where you could where you could say that the donkey is actually about a human, but the story itself is about a donkey. And I think that if the rabbis wanted to talk about your point, which which is an excellent one, that the learning and deeds of a common person are valued by the divine, just like those of a learned person. I think that's certainly the case, and is a great value and a great point. But this story is actually about a donkey. So that, and I'm taking seriously the non-humans in the text and the donkeys, which itself is an interpretive stance that has not often been taken. And so I am reading the texts at their word rather than allegorizing them, and then trying to make sense of what they mean. I also think that the rabbis in general, the rabbis of the land of Israel, of the Mishnah, the Tosefta, the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Midrashic collections, both Amoraic and Tannaitic, and the rabbis of the Bavli, don't generally allegorize in their reading strategies when they read the Torah or biblical texts. They sometimes will say that certain things mean other things in a symbolic key, but that really is a reading strategy of the Torah that is picked up and developed much more in the Middle Ages, starting with the Zohar and onwards. So I approach rabbinic texts in the same way that the later rabbis approach earlier rabbinic texts, and that the early rabbis and later rabbis approach the Hebrew Bible. But thank you for that question. It's a wonderful one.
Okay, great. There was many comments and questions really along those lines, just about allegory. Aren't we really meant to learn from these about the mitzvot? So I wonder, maybe since there are so many comments along those lines, maybe you can even go a little bit further. So are you arguing? I guess are you sort of just presenting just parallel and not necessarily incompatible ways of reading the text? We can look at it this way to draw lessons about observance of the mitzvot or religious values, interpersonal values out of it, and or we can read it, we can mine it for relationships with animals. Or do you think that those are in tension? Do you think one is more valid than the other?
So I think in this tale, I don't think it's about a person. I think it's about a donkey. I think there's plenty of places in the Yerushalmi and in rabbinic texts where they do talk about those sorts of values. But I think it's really important when dealing with rabbinic literature to know that it's not one genre of text. And of course, all literature and religious literature, any literature can be approached from a plethora of lenses. So I never say that that's not there, because if you can read it there and you can substantiate it, absolutely. But my claim in this text and in my work in general is that rabbinic texts should also be seen as ancient science. This is also about animals. The rabbis were concerned with animals. I don't know how else you can, they're concerned with animals and agriculture and cosmology and disease. I have a forthcoming article in Jewish Studies Quarterly that's about disease. And I think when you look at rabbinic texts in the context of late antiquity, this certainly makes sense. The same people who might have been philosophers were also scientists. So the same people who might have been novelists or poets were also scientists and dealing with these questions. And the rabbis are no different, the rabbis of late antiquity, in that sense, are no different than other local experts in that their mastery of knowledge and their concern with knowledge was not only religious, or what we would call today religious. They were concerned with the mastery of knowledge across all spheres of life. And we can see that if we look at the 6 different orders of the Mishnah, which are certainly not restricted to ritual law.
Great, that's very helpful. So whether or not one wants to read it as metaphor, you're arguing that this is the stuff of everyday life for them, and there's plenty going on that straightforward level that we need to learn about. Okay, thank you. And there were a handful of other questions about actually about the Yerushalmi and sort of what what you're getting from the Yerushalmi regarding animals, would you find it in the Bavli and the Babylonian Talmud as well? And also, did the two Talmudim have kind of different legacies in this regard in terms of subsequent Jewish literature and text?
Excellent. So I'm actually going to touch on that in a little bit when we come to the next story in this narrative sequence. And I cannot say definitively. I think it's really different in different cases and different stories. As Beth Berkowitz has expertly shown in her book on Animals and Animality, the Babylonian Talmud, there's a plethora of voices. Rabbinic literature is multivocal, which means that there's lots of different opinions and voices and approaches to everything, to any subject they deal with, animals included. So here I am explicating the voice of the Yerushalmi itself in these series of narratives, because it's the narrator and the editor of the Yerushalmi that's putting them together. And Professor Berkowitz, in her book, I think has more convincingly noted, her thesis, I think, is certainly that it's multivocal and there's various voices, but generally she comes to the place where the Stam or the editor of the Bavli is not so super concerned with animal ethics or the suffering of animals. But again, it would have to be taken on a case-by-case basis. But it's really an excellent question. And hopefully somebody will write on it soon.
I'm just going to throw this in just before we totally leave that topic and move on to your next text, but really more on the same. Someone is asking, do they deal with the same animals, the same species? Are there sort of different personalities of the animals in the two texts? Right, I mean, obviously we're in the same general part of the world, but there are different types of agriculture within these areas. I don't know if you have more to comment on that, but it's an interesting line of questioning how animals might be personified differently by rabbis in different centers.
Absolutely, I think that would be a great study for somebody to undertake. I don't have the answer. I mean, what I can definitely say certainly is that in narrative sequences throughout rabbinic literature, whether it's the Yerushalmi or Bereshit Rabbah or the Bavli, animals often have personalities, whether they are talking or not. And there might be similar traits given to them in different texts, in different compendiums. I mean, that sort of question of the difference between the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, you'd really have to look at stories or legal sugiyot that the Bavli reworks in the Yerushalmi, which my advisor and teacher Jeffrey Rubenstein has done in many of his books, or all of his books about Babylonian stories. That's really his approach, not specifically on animals, but the difference between rabbinic Babylonian culture and Palestinian rabbinic culture. So it would be a great study to undertake. Maybe I'll do it, maybe someone else will do it, but also really a great line of questioning. Thanks.
Great. So I think we can move on, and I'll just reiterate the request to go to teach more slowly.
Okay, I'll definitely keep that in mind. All right, great. So let's jump into the next part of the lecture. All right, so in the next story on Yerushalmi Demai, we meet a clash of worlds in Rebbe Pinchas's meeting with Rebbe Yehuda HaNasi. In this story, Rebbe, the Jewish patriarch and editor of the Mishnah, desires to lessen the severity of the sabbatical, but his desire to do so is pitted against Rebbe Pinchas ben Yair. While this conflict over law does not manage to derail the camaraderie of the sages, animal mistreatment in Rebbe's household does. The story begins with a statement of desire from Rebbe, whom according to the Yerushalmi edited the Mishnah, and had a high level of prestige and power as the patriarch of the Jews of Palestine. So Rebbe Pinchas ben Yair was Rebbe desired to loosen some restrictions of the sabbatical year. At this time, Rebbe Pinchas ben Yair came to him. Rebbe said to Rebbe Pinchas, "What is happening with the crops?" He replied, "The wild endives are beautiful." Rebbe asked him again, "What is happening with the crops?" And Rebbe Pinchas replied back to him again, "The wild endives are beautiful." And Rebbe knew that he did not agree with him. Rebbe said to him, "Will the master eat a little bit with us today?" He replied to him, "Yes." So the Yerushalmi tells us that Rebbe wants to lessen the severity of the sabbatical year, which happens every 7 years, in which there is a cessation of agriculture and taxes, private property is abolished, and debts are forgiven. This path of leniency of Rebbe itself is not strange or surprising for several reasons. This path of leniency vis-a-vis the sabbatical year was set out by Rebbe's ancestor Hillel, who created the prose bowl, the sake of Tikkun Olam. This was a way of getting around debt forgiveness in the sabbatical year. Indeed, we know from many extant Tannaitic traditions that Rebbe and his house after him actually did rule to attenuate many facets of the sabbatical year, and that some older laws of the sabbatical year, which upheld many of its socially and environmentally radical elements, such as the abolishment of private property, the forgiveness of debt, the inclusion of animals in various rituals, and care for the land as actor and ethical subject, were either abnegated for the sake of tikkun olam, fixing the world, which in the rabbinic context really is very different than how it's used today. There, it really means for the sake of a well-functioning society. So you can kind of think about it as a regulatory mechanism of making laws lenient that would make it too difficult for debt markets to function, for the institution of marriage and divorce to be easily entered into and gotten out of, and things like that. And also the place of animals and land in the laws became obscured in the Mishnah. Gerald Blidstein, a scholar of rabbinics, noticed this in his article when he wrote that the sabbatical year threatens the maintenance of society. What is strange, however, is that this story portrays the powerful Rebbe appealing his desire to Rebbe Pinchas ben Yair, a holy man and ascetic, who assumedly has little political or legal clout, even as his piety and abilities have great renown. It is not clear why this is the case. But what we do know is that Rebbe seeks that Rebbe Pinchas will sympathize with him when he asks Rebbe Pinchas about the status of the year's crops. In this question, we can understand that Rebbe is asking whether Rebbe Pinchas agrees with Rebbe in his desire to allow some agricultural activity because there are no crops to assess. It is the sabbatical year and none can be grown. Rebbe is assessing where Rebbe Pinchas stands and hopes that Rebbe Pinchas will answer in the vein of something like, "Oi, there's no crops because of the sabbatical year and the people are suffering deeply because of this. And definitely let's change the laws." However, instead of validating Rebbe's desire, Rebbe Pinchas informs Rebbe that the wild endives, wild vegetation which grows on its own, and is thus not forbidden according to the laws of the sabbatical year, are beautiful. Rebbe asks the same question again. We can imagine Rebbe further impressing his question upon Rebbe Pinchas with increased emphasis, just to make sure Rebbe Pinchas understands what he is asking. And yet, Rebbe is met with the exact same answer. We can understand from this exchange that Rebbe Pinchas is perfectly fine with the laws of the sabbatical year just as they are. He agrees to their intention and their goals. He has no problem with the difficulty on the people because the sabbatical year is also meant to benefit animals in the land. And this can only be achieved through the cessation of agriculture and the other radical actions to be taken during the sabbatical year. Rebbe Pinchas does not agree with Rebbe because he understands that, of course, these elements of the sabbatical year threaten business as usual, as they should. However, Rebbe Pinchas also understands that in the place of regular crops, there will be a turn to the wild and a beautiful wild bounty waiting to be harvested. And as we saw in the stories that preceded this one, Rebbe Pinchas utilizes his abilities to help all those around him, implying that he was not disregarding the needs of his fellow people. To the contrary, Rebbe Pinchas also knows that God's laws are embedded within the creation, and that following them prevents disaster and leads to material well-being. After this tense exchange, Rebbe quickly turns from this request to invite Rebbe Pinchas to eat with him. Rebbe Pinchas agrees, and we are led to believe that the tension between the two sages is resolved and that no further drama will ensue. Despite this possible relief, the story then again turns sour, with Rebbe Pinchas growing angry at Rebbe over the way his mules are treated and storming away. The story continues. When he was leaving Rebbe's house, he saw Rebbe's mule standing outside. He said, "All these the Jews nurture, but Rebbe does not. May I never see his face again." At first glance, it is not clear exactly What about Rebbe's treatment of his mules upsets Rebbe Pinchas? According to Pnei Moshe, a 19th century commentator in the Yerushalmi, based on Bavli Huli in 7b, Rebbe Pinchas grows angry over seeing the mules of Rebbe's on Rebbe's property because they are animals that cause damage. However, this is a difficult reading to sustain, as mules are common animals throughout Tannaitic literature and throughout the Yerushalmi, and are assumed to be regular fixtures of the late antique Jewish farmstead. Rebbe Pinchas himself is a donkey companion, a related animal to a mule. Rather, we should understand from Rebbe Pinchas's words that Rebbe is mistreating his mules, which all other Jews treat properly. So I think here's an example of this difference between the Yerushalmi, where it's very terse, and the Bavli, where they expand upon it and take an interpretive stance on the Yerushalmi, that the Bavli isn't willing to entertain that what gets in between Rebbe Pinchas and Rebbe is Rebbe's treatment of his mules. And in my opinion, the Bavli offers a forced interpretation, which says that Rebbe Pinchas is somewhat angry or upset at Rebbe that he has mules on his property and that mules are species that are destructive to property and people. But this is not the case. Mules are found all over the Yerushalmi and Tannaitic literature. So I would surmise from that the Bavli itself explains away a care of animal suffering within this narrative sequence. Okay, so let's keep going on with this story. So in my reading, we should understand from Rebbe Pinchas's words that Rebbe is mistreating his mules, which all other Jews treat properly. We can surmise that his mules are standing outside at mealtime when Rebbe Pinchas is either going or coming from dinner, and they're not being fed. Tannaitic sources and sources in the Yerushalmi, based on biblical precedent, rule that farm animals must be fed before their owners. Indeed, the feeding of animals and care for their needs, both settled and wild, feature prominently in the early rabbinic sabbatical year laws, which are a central focus of our tale. I suggest that the Pnei Moshe and the Bavli misread the story because they misread who Rebbe Pinchas is and miss his deep care for animals, despite his characterization directly before the story as being enmeshed in divine nature cultures, which highlights communion with animals and his care for his own donkey. In light of these previous tales, we can imagine how surprised and angered Rebbe Pinchas might be that Rebbe mistreats his animals. Indeed, in my reading, Rebbe Pinchas is flabbergasted at how somebody as greatly esteemed as Rebbe does not see that God also wants him to care for his mules. We also must note that Rebbe Pinchas's encounter with Rebbe's animals changes the events of the story. Rebbe's animals, like the animals in the previous tales, stray far from the dominant Western view of animals as passive, which may not hold at all when it comes to rabbinic literature. In our story, on the contrary, they are the active agents that change the dynamic of the whole narrative far and beyond any other actor by altering the political field in a dramatic way, creating an impassable rift between the patriarch and the holy man. This inversion of agency, however, is only noticed when one encounters non-humans for what they are and what they do, without any prior assumptions of who and what is a subject and what is agency. Bruno Latour, philosopher and sociologist, explains that, quote, as soon as we come close to non-human beings, we do not find in them the inertia that would allow us, by contrast, to take ourselves to be agents, but on the contrary, we find agencies or actors that are no longer without connection to what we are and what we do, end quote. In other words, we find other agencies and potent subjectivities that create us. In our story, when it comes down to the question of who acts upon who, there is no abyss between the human and the animal. There is a clear line of connection between the affect of Rebbe's mules and what Rebbe Pinchas does and how he relates to Rebbe and his house. It matters not that Rebbe Pinchas is in part relating to Rebbe's mistreatment of the mules, for it is the very ethical fabric of animality and the singularity of the mules and their suffering that is immediately acting upon Rebbe Pinchas. Being a subject, writes Latour, does not mean acting in an autonomous fashion in relation to an objective context. Rather, it means sharing agency with other subjects that have also lost their autonomy, end quote. What he means is that humans and animals constitute each other and constrain each other and cause each other to do things. It's not just humans who cause animals to act. Animals act upon humans in strange ways, even as humans think that they are the agents of power and change. The view that animals are passive is imploded by Rebbe Pinchas as he uncovers how the creation is a divine nature culture. Similarly, Rebbe Pinchas's donkey, as we saw, was the active driver of the first narrative, causing humans to behave in new and different ways. The donkey is able to make the thieves repent by returning her. And she forces Rebbe Pinchas's students to take demai from produce for her, even though this is not required by law. Rebbe Pinchas's donkey is a powerful actant in that story, acting upon the law itself, further refracting God's commandments through another way of being, creating another permutation in the divine nature culture that Rebbe Pinchas disperses through his orbit. In animal-human encounters like these, humans become with animals and in turn are changed and altered through the encounter. As Haraway has indicated, these sorts of encounters generate effects and forces that create worldings and becomings. They create different people, different subjects and different animals and different surroundings. To come into contact with animals creates new worlds. In our narrative, we can see this very clearly. Animals as powerful actors and the encounter value that is generated between humans and their animals is reflected in the rabbinic sabbatical year laws as well, which Rebbe seeks to attenuate. The early rabbinic sabbatical year laws in various areas of concern, such as the destruction of sabbatical year produce, which in Hebrew is called biur, force greater contact and encounter between humans and animals in a way that is more powerful because animals and their needs are brought into national consciousness. The institution of biur, basically how the sabbatical year works, is that agriculture is forbidden in the 7th year. Once crops that would grow on their own, such as wheat from the previous year, are no longer found in the fields in the 7th year or the beginning of the 8th year, any previously stored crops must be brought out and made ownerless for the benefit of humans and for animals. And it's tied to when wild animals have access to that same type of crop in the fields. It's a little more complicated than that, but I think that's kind of the general gist of biur. And so the rabbinic sabbatical year laws hoist animals into the national imagination through their central place in various laws such as biur and the abolishment of tithing and private property. The sabbatical year in both the Hebrew Bible and the early rabbinic texts is both a radical and progressive ritual that offers the potential for rest, renewal, and reconfiguration, and a returning of care to and renewed becoming with the non-human world. For the early rabbis in the Yerushalmi, it is a reformulation and revolution of the social and political fields. It offers the potential for a restart and a rethinking of what can be for the future in the context of the past. And so at stake between Rebbe and Rebbe Pinchas is not only the sabbatical year and its attendant care, ethics, and agency afforded to animals, but also the very self-identity of each of these sages and their broader vision for the Jewish collective, not only in relation to other humans, but also to God and the rest of the creation. Whereas Rebbe has a restricted notion of humanity and religion, in which laws are limits and non-humans are resources, Rebbe Pinchas sees laws reflected and refracted through the myriad creatures in God's creation. He views non-humans as vital, animated partners to humanity in the drama of becoming and worlding, and the common dwelling on a shared home. And our story is informing us that it is this very dichotomy and tension between Rebbe's position of humans as the unique repository of agency and non-humans as resources to be harvested, versus Rebbe Pinchas's vision of living ecologies, relationships, and non-humans as living ecologies, relationships, and dispersed agency and identity that also lies at the core of the sabbatical year in both its biblical and rabbinic presentations. Their argument over the sabbatical year is representative of their wider vision of the creation. And once Rebbe Pinchas realizes this, he leaves, never to speak to Rebbe again. For it is beyond unacceptable to Rebbe Pinchas to see Rebbe act this way. God, in another story, which we'll turn to shortly, punishes Rebbe for this very view of animals and the creation. After Rebbe Pinchas leaves, Rebbe sends his messengers to appease him. They went and told Rebbe. Rebbe sent to appease Rebbe Pinchas. They caught up with him near his town. He said, "Townsfolk, draw near me." His townsfolk came down and surrounded him so that Rebbe's messengers could not reach him. The messengers said to them, "Rebbe wants to appease him." The townsfolk left and went their way. He said, "Children of my dear one, God, draw near me." Fire descended from heaven and surrounded him so that Rebbe's messengers could not reach him. Rebbe's messengers catch up to Rebbe Pinchas near his town. But Rebbe Pinchas calls his townsfolk to form a barrier between him and the messengers. These common folk side with Rebbe Pinchas to block Rebbe's agents from coming to him, despite Rebbe's desire to allow them to farm. Even though the sabbatical year poses a difficulty to the lives of everyday folk, this section shows that they ultimately trust Rebbe Pinchas and that their needs did not require an abolishment of the sabbatical year. Perhaps, as was the case for most of the ancient world, regular townsfolk and commoners were frequently involved in foraging and would have had no problem supplementing the annual vegetables that they could not preserve with wild vegetation and fruits. At this point, the messengers are stuck, but after they tell the townsfolk that they are there on the behalf of Rebbe, they disperse, assumedly out of respect for Rebbe and his power, piety, and charisma. As other stories throughout the Yerushalmi show, Rebbe was also highly regarded, not only for his power, but also his piety. After the townsfolk disperse, Rebbe Pinchas calls to heaven to separate him from Rebbe's agents so that they can never appease him. At this request, a barrier of fire falls from heaven, and Rebbe's agents give up and leave to tell Rebbe of the outcome. This section of the story shows that not only heaven, but average townsfolk agree with Rebbe Pinchas and his stance on the sabbatical year. My supposition is that this has as much to do with his care for the townsfolk as it does for his care for animals and other non-humans. For this story depicts another dimension of Rebbe Pinchas's divine nature culture, also portrayed in the litany of stories that precede and follow this tale. In the final part of the tale, we are shown Rebbe lamenting this outcome, declaring that he will be able to commune with Rebbe Pinchas in the world to come. They went and told Rebbe. He said, "Because we did not merit to satiate ourselves from him in this world, may we merit to satiate ourselves from him in the world to come." The ending of our story displays Rebbe's high esteem of Rebbe Pinchas, adding prestige and charisma to the holy man's character in our narrative. It also shows that Rebbe himself might understand Rebbe Pinchas's position on both the sabbatical year and his animals, despite his actions, hearkening to Rebbe's own repentance on his relationship with animals that he makes in another Talmudic tale from the Yerushalmi, which we will look at next. From these various stories, we can discern that the Yerushalmi leaves the ethical choice between the position of Rebbe and the position of Rebbe Pinchas as no choice at all. Rebbe Pinchas is beloved by all the actors of the divine nature culture in which he is entangled, including Rebbe, his townsfolk, and God. Through the character of Rebbe Pinchas, the Yerushalmi presents us with an ethics of being in the world that demands compassion, care, and noticing of all actors and subjects, human and non-human alike, and takes the ethical stance that being in companionship and becoming with animals, non-humans, and God is the preferred path. I will pause here for questions again, but before returning to the famous tale of Rebbe and the calf and concluding from there.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, this question is from someone who knows her Talmudic rabbis. So she's asking that Rabbi Pinchas is apparently known to be sort of unique, a miracle worker, sort of stands apart from others. And does that make the lessons of the story, of these stories, potentially less universal?
Let's come back to that at the end of my talk, because I'm going to touch on that in a little bit. It's a great question, though.
Okay, great. There are a few questions. This is not directly on what you were just teaching on, but a few questions about if we can apply your way of reading these stories to biblical animals as well. And there's so many examples. We have Bilam's donkey, we have the snake in the Garden of Eden, we have the whale or the fish with Jonah, and many more examples. So I guess the question is, would you guide us to read really to read values about relationships with animals from those stories more than we might have been taught to do?
Absolutely. I actually just taught my last class session today, a class at JTS this semester on animals and animality, really the question of the animal in the Torah and rabbinic literature. And yes, I totally think that paying attention to animals in biblical literature, just like in rabbinic literature, can teach us a lot about what God or what these texts think about how humans should act towards animals. And there's some great literature out there. I mean, one book that comes off the top of my head is Ken Stone's book, Reading the Bible with Animal Studies, which is a wonderful book. Thanks.
Great. Another question was, does the Talmud reference more emotional influences of animals like love or companionship rather than only ethical issues?
It's a good question. I don't know. Maybe this is a good place to continue on, and we'll wrap up in a little bit with some final Q&A. Or is there another question? I mean, if there's another question that you wanted to.
Also a more general question, but
go ahead. We'll take one more and then go on.
Okay. This person was asking sort of how far can we take this? Specifically, could you find a rabbinic source that would argue, even a minority opinion that would argue that we actually could put animal life on the same level as human life? And if one were, in theory, in a situation where one had to choose between saving this one or saving that one, is there any argument that that a human life wouldn't necessarily take precedence? Is there any idea that they're on the same plane?
Absolutely not. No, the rabbis definitely put human life above animal life. This is not deep ecology. There's no trace of that. Humans can kill animals for food within biblical and rabbinic traditions. It's undoubtedly that human life is prioritized in such an ethical situation as that. What we do find in these texts are particular ethical mandates towards animals, and that animals do call us to responsiveness. And those ethical mandates are different depending on the different situations and the context and whether we can prevent the suffering. The halachic term Ba'al Tzari Chayim, which is a prohibition on suffering undue harm to animals, is a real prohibition. But no, absolutely, human life is more important than animal life. It's a great question. So we cannot take what I'm saying that far, nor would Rebbe Pinchas or Rebbe or the Yerushalmi.
Great. So why don't we continue?
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, great. So if the Yerushalmi's preference for Rebbe Pinchas's ethical stance towards non-humans was not clear enough from our sugya in Yerushalmi Damai, it becomes even clearer when turning to the Yerushalmi's version of the famous tale of Rebbe and the calf. When we read these two tales together, I hope that I'll be able to answer the question of Rebbe Pinchas's uniqueness, Rebbe's uniqueness, and I think that what the Yerushalmi, wants us to learn. So Rebbe's character and life, according to Yerushalmi Kilayim, are no less shaped by his relationship to animals than Rebbe Pinchas ben Yair. But the world that Rebbe forms around him has much starker dichotomies than Rebbe Pinchas, and has much less room for reaching across dividing lines with compassion and care. Yet he does not realize this until he has suffered a great deal. Rebbe is depicted as uncaring for animals, and because of this is struck with a terrible toothache for 13 years, until he repents with an uncalled for act of loving kindness towards helpless animals, much like we would expect of Rebbe Pinchas ben Yair. Why don't we turn to the tale and we'll go from there. So Rebbe dwelled in the city of Tziporian for 17 years, and he repeated the verse from Genesis 47:28 about himself. Jacob lived 17 years in the land of Egypt. so that the span of Jacob's life came to 147 years. Yehuda lived in Tziporim for 17 years. Yehuda is Rebbe Yehuda Nasi. Yehuda lived in Tziporim for 17 years, and of that time, he suffered from a toothache for 13 years. Rebbe Yossi ben Bun said, for all those 13 years, laboring women did not die in the land of Israel, nor is there a miscarriage in the land of Israel. And why did he suffer from a toothache? One time he was passing by and saw a calf being taken to slaughter. The calf, cried and said to Rebbe, Rebbe, save me. Rebbe replied, for this you were created. And in the end, how is the toothache released? He saw them, Rebbe saw members of his household killing a nest of mice. He said to them, leave them, for it is written in Psalm 145, verse 9, the Lord is good to all, and his mercy is upon all his works. So in this story, we are shown another side of Rebbe's indifference towards animals during his younger years, forming an even sharper contrast with Rebbe Pinchas and providing a backdrop to our story. We could perhaps even imagine that the conflict between Rebbe Pinchas and Rebbe happened during this 13 years. We don't know. So this story explains that Rebbe suffered from a toothache for 13 years because of his indifference towards a crying calf that begged Rebbe to help him and save him from slaughter. Rather than meeting the calf as a subject in mental anguish, begging for help, Rebbe replies heartlessly, telling the calf that it only exists for human benefit. Clearly, the Yerushalmi and all the other rabbinic compendiums that contain this story, Bereshit Rabbah and the Bavli, do not agree with Rebbe's stance. Rather, as we learned in the past story, animals should exist as subjects and actors in their own right and must be shown compassion and care. They are members of the community of concern. While humans are permitted to slaughter and eat animals also must be met as individual subjects. While it may be acceptable to the author of the Sugya that part of the function of animals in the world is that they provide food for humans, this in no way exhausts their being in the world. And Rebbe's statement, for this you were created, is a grave ethical blunder. But they do not solely exist for any single instrumental purpose. Rather, they are subjects with their own lives. The calf even speaks to Rebbe using language, the capacity through which onkelos defines the human soul. While animals can be deployed for human benefit as workers, transportation, or even food, these are functions that, according to Haraway, provide opportunities for becoming through encounter value, rather than exhausting the being of the animal. Indeed, Rebbe would never have met this calf were it not for the calf's inclusion as potential food for humans. Yet, to deny animal subjectivity and care, as Rebbe does here, is a grave error and moral failing that brings upon Rebbe a terrible affliction as a result. It is not until he repents from this error and begins to see animals as companions in the drama of life that his toothache is lifted. The story recounts that 13 years after the incident with the calf, Rebbe finally repents. He saves a nest of mice from being killed. Mice, as we saw, are a species that Rebbe Pinchas is frequently in companionship and dialogue with, intertextually connecting this tale to the litany of tales about Rebbe Pinchas in Yerushalmi Damai. This intertextual connection shows that Rebbe moves closer to the ethical position of Rebbe Pinchas in his treatment of non-humans in the conclusion of this tale. Rebbe cites a verse from Psalms in the process of saving the mice. In citing this verse, we can perhaps surmise that Rebbe realizes that God wants him to walk through the world valuing animals because God does. His mercy is upon all his works. The Lord is good to all, and his mercy is upon all his works. While Rebbe may not have reached the same position of Rebbe Pinchas, viewing the world as an integrated divine nature culture, at the end of this tale, from both of these textual features, we can suggest that Rebbe is on the way there. And this ethical movement further solidifies the Yerushalmi's ethical stance that humans should exist with animals as companion species, showing them care and compassion. And as Rebbe Pinchas's character displays, this is not only the ethically preferable thing to do, but it is also pragmatic, as it leads to better outcomes through emergent practices. Through heeding the ethics of interpretation to locate and describe the non-human in the pages of the Yerushalmi, we have also uncovered the Yerushalmi's ethics of becoming with non-humans, depicted through Rebbe Pinchas ben Yair. As we have seen, Rebbe Pinchas becomes with animals and is able to solve problems for his constituents through emergent practices that collect together various agents and subjectivities of the divine nature culture of the Talmud Yerushalmi. Such an ethics is also entangled with Rebbe Pinchas's ontological stance, or what he thinks the world is. The proper understanding of the world for Rebbe Pinchas is that God's divine law is refracted not only through human intellect, but also through animal bodies and instincts, and seemingly inanimate features of the landscape, such as rivers, which really are not inanimate at all. If God's law is refracted and developed through non-humans, then these creatures obviously demand consideration and care. They are intelligent and have their own lives apart from human needs, even as humans can deploy them and use them for their own benefit. Rebbe himself eventually comes to this understanding in the tale of Rebbe and the calf. But it took him 13 years of suffering to arrive at the Yerushalmi's preferred ethical orientation towards the creation. This story also tells us that despite this being the ultimate destination of humanity in relation to the rest of God's creation, upheld through a verse from Psalms, this is not an ethical orientation that can be expected of everyone, nor an easy orientation to arrive at. All the stories that surround the tale of Rebbe and the calf in Yerushalmi Gilayim depict Rebbe's piety and greatness. Even this story, which depicts Rebbe's ethical and moral failing, also notes that through his suffering, there were no deaths from childbirth or miscarriages during those 13 years. I think we should understand from this contextualization of Rebbe that the Yerushalmi also concedes that not everybody can be Rebbe Pinchas, even as he is extolled through the Yerushalmi. Yet, if the Yerushalmi is concerned with shaping ethical subjects through its stories, then it does ultimately want all of us to become subjects of Rebbe Pinchas's divine nature culture and to become with animals as companion species. We can safely say that Rebbe Pinchas's ethics of the non-human is also the Yerushalmi's ideal ethical orientation as well. Thank you for listening to my talk, and I look forward to hearing your final questions.
Great, thank you.
Sure, thank you.
Okay, there was a question on the verse that was invoked in the last story. Are there biblical sources, are there sources from, sorry, let me just reread the question. So are there other biblical sources, especially in the Torah, that would go against the point of view that animals are elevated in becoming food for humans, and instead support the belief that animals can and maybe should be companions?
I don't think the Bible takes a stance that they shouldn't be food and they should be companions. I think there's many verses that show both. And I think really the stance that I've been speaking about here is really that for the Yerushalmi and for Rebbe Pinchas, animals are multifaceted. It's not an either or. Either they're food or they're companions, but rather both. They're both transportation, food, helpers, workers, and subjects and friends and companions. And different animals fill different roles. Great question.
So there are a few comments and questions about, really bringing this to our lives. So I'll share them together. So one person was commenting about the phenomenon of so many people getting pets during this period of pandemic isolation. And is there anything from your message that we might connect there? And then also the question of vegetarianism and veganism came up. People are wondering, is there any evidence that any of the rabbis are vegetarians? Someone asked if you are a vegan and how that might connect to how you're reading the text.
Thanks so much. So I doubt that any of the rabbis of the Yerushalmi were vegan or vegetarian. I'm personally not vegan. I was for many years and vegetarian. I do, however, only eat ethically slaughtered meat, pastured and ethically slaughtered meat, which reduces the suffering of animals, as some of you may know, animals that are cows, for example, that are raised in industrial agricultural systems are fed corn and other grains, and cows biologically are not designed to eat corn or grains, and this causes suffering and disease, which is then passed on to the consumer who eats that diseased, unhealthy cow. So it's really bad for us and bad for the animals. Also then waste, their manure becomes a problem rather than being reincorporated into the same grassland ecosystems in which the cows grazed. So I think that, speaking from in our tradition, I mean, how I relate to eating animals is that there are particular ways that animals are meant to be slaughtered to reduce their suffering, to differentiate us from the way that animals might kill other animals. And we're heeded to not make animals suffer in needless ways, which the industrial agricultural system does, whether it's a kosher slaughterhouse or not. So in my opinion, I think this calls us to take very seriously animal abuse that happens on very, very large scales to billions of animals and their suffering under industrial agricultural systems. And really, I think it's a it's a direct edict, if we care about the ethics of rabbinic texts, to not eat industrially processed meat. I think, so other parts of that question, there are rabbis who have been vegetarian. I mean, Rav Kook, who was the chief rabbi of Israel before the founding of its state, was famously vegetarian during the week, but not on the week, not for Shabbat. And in his estimation, eventually we all will become vegetarians once the third temple would be built. But currently it's too hard for people. I mean, in his time when he was writing in the early 20th century, there were too many competing ethical stances, and that by becoming vegetarian, one might come to see the lives of animals as equal to the lives of humans, which in his view was a grave error. But I think it's a very commendable ethical stance to be vegan or vegetarian, not only because of animal suffering, but also because of climate change, which is going to cause immense suffering to every living thing when we're headed on a terrible path towards that. And the largest emitter of greenhouse gases is animal agriculture. So hands down, so becoming vegan for that reason is, and for any of the ethical reasons, I think is very commendable. And I cannot speak to pets, but I think they're great.
Yeah, I guess I would say the same way that there's so much in our quotidian lives that we're experiencing differently in the pandemic. We got a fish for the pandemic, but I pay a lot more attention to the fish and think about his quality of life than I think I would otherwise. I confess. So in that way, I think right, there's a certain familiarity in the stories that you've shared that maybe we can relate to, that pet owners can relate to more than other folks, or more than we might have in the past. Right, so one more interesting question just came in about assimilating what you've just shared in terms of right, it's a problem to see an animal's purpose as being for our food, but not categorically a problem to use an animal for food. So this person was wondering about animal sacrifice in the temple, and right, we know that the thousands of animals were slaughtered in the temple, including young animals, and but just to put an even finer point on it, this person is reminding us that the Bible talks about the pleasure that God takes in the scent of the sacrifices. So how do we work with that?
Absolutely. I don't think it causes a problem for what I've presented, because I think that animals can be many things. Animals can be companions and animals can be sacrifices. But to reduce animals or an animal to just that in meeting it as a subject I think is a grave error, as the Yerushalmi shows us for Rebbe, that the calf, even though I don't think that the Yerushalmi there is saying that Rebbe should have saved the calf. I don't think that that's what Rebbe's error was. Maybe he could have done that, and that would have been fun. That would have been great. But I think his error is dismissing the calf and the calf's suffering so cruelly, and reducing the calf to an instrument, rather than saying, yeah, you're a living being. Whether the calf, whether in the story, right, I'm taking this as literature, so the calf is talking to him, but you could imagine a similar scenario where the calf just comes up to him and looks at him, and Rebbe thinks in his mind, wow, this calf is asking me to save it. One would not have to save that calf, although Rebbe easily could have. He could have bought it and then raised it and slaughtered it later, or used it as a dairy cow. Who knows? But I don't think that the point is that animals have to be one thing or another, but rather that they're multiple things, and that their individual lives matter. Thanks.
Right. It seems like the reducing of the calf to it's only there for us is what seems to cause his problems. That question actually reminded me that way early on in the class, there was another question about sacrifices, and specifically about animals that have a mum, some kind of defect that renders them ineligible for sacrifice, and how those animals are sort of left to die off, I suppose. So that certainly is regarding the animal, it seems, as being, right, its purpose is for the sacrifice and not beyond that. So I wonder if you have a comment on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's just giving criteria for what animal can be sacrificed, and that animal got saved. That animal can't be sacrificed, and it's allowed to live its life freely. It can graze and eat and then die naturally. It just can't be sacrificed. It can't be brought into the sacrificial system. That doesn't reduce the animal into a sacrificial entity as just that. Just that individual got lucky.
So that was my understanding. The person who asked the question was saying that that in certain circumstances, she's citing Psachim, Bavli Psachim, that animals that are deemed unfit for sacrifice are apparently locked away and left to die, which was news to me. I thought you might know about that.
So I don't know, but I don't think that's the case. I'm pretty positive they're sent out to pasture. I'm pretty sure that what it means in those sources is that they're sent out. They're just allowed to graze and then
go back to their normal lives. Right. So
yeah, I mean, again, I don't know. I'm not positive, but I'm pretty sure they're not starved to death.
Okay. So I think that covers most of the questions. I don't know if we have 1 minute left. I don't know if you want to add any, a last word.
No, thanks so much. Those were great questions, and I was really happy to teach. Thanks for having me. Thank you for teaching us. It was even more different from our previous sessions than I thought it would be. So thank you for sharing your, not only the material about animals and really pushing us to think about those relationships and what lessons we can draw from the stories, but also just sharing with us more broadly your way of reading the Talmudic sources. So that has enlightened us beyond the specific topic as well. So thank you for teaching us today and for teaching JTS students this year. Thank you. I want to thank everyone for coming, and we hope to see you next week. Rabbi Jan Urbach will be teaching us on the existential tension of similarity and difference. So yet another fresh take in contrast to previous sessions on our theme of the other. So we hope to see you there. Thanks to everyone again for joining us. And thank you again to Dr. Weisberg for teaching today.